Ladies and gentlemen, this is an exciting topic for me. What do we do with old wells on our properties? Every well has its own history, its own story, and some of them are a little bit more exciting than others. But the main idea is once we understand what the wells are, it makes our life a lot easier in terms of how we want to deal with them. Today, what I'm going to talk about is give you a little bit of a background in terms of the wells that have not been plugged in Ontario, some of the perils, risks involved in it, briefly touch on some of the geological engineering aspects of it, and show you how do we approach these wells and where do we get the information. Ontario has a really rich and long history of drilling of oil and gas wells. In the past 160 years, we've seen a lot of new technologies get developed in the province, and we've seen a lot of changes. We've seen some boom bust cycles. We've also seen new technologies that were developed so we could drill the wells. These pictures are taken in oil springs. We can see there's been a long history in Ontario. And when we start looking at Ontario in terms of where the oil and the gas is, that's usually an indication of where you may find old wells on your properties. I know there's some areas that there were some exploratory wells done, but usually this pool and pipeline kind of gives you an idea where we know that the oil and gas are known to exist. Now this is kind of a really awkward drawing. It shows you an estimate of about 50,000 wells. There's an estimated 27,000 of those wells that have been recorded, that we have records on in the Oil, Gas, and Salt Resources Library. We're looking at about 1,700 active natural gas wells and about 1,100 oil wells that are active in the province of Ontario now. There are many wells that may or may not show up on this map. And I do want to issue a caution regarding this map. These maps are somewhat, it shows us to be really bad, but typically the wells quite often only have like an 8-inch to a 12-inch surface kind of casing sticking up. So if you did it to scale, you probably would not see anything on this map. Wells that are not properly plugged and abandoned can pose a lot of different types of risk. It could lead to contamination of soils. It could lead to fires, explosions, groundwater contamination. It could provide pathways for fluids to come upwards or for fluids to go downwards. And there's a potential as well, some of these wells could contain hydrogen sulphide, which is a poisonous substance. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. How do you go about finding a well on your property? There are usually some telltale signs. And especially when you're looking at known areas where wells are known to exist, you may see some of these things, especially for these type of oil wells. Now, when you have these kind of surface features, you have to take safety precautions in terms of protecting yourself, understanding that these are pathways for fluids to migrate up as well, and they could contain some poisonous gases as well as explosive gases. Some of the other things that you may find with older wells, you may find a wet spot that perhaps indicate a well that was formerly used but has been buried. You could potentially have vapors coming out of a well or some of the features associated with it. So my advice is always approach any unknown well with caution. It's important to have the knowledge in terms of what to look for, in terms of what to do with it. Sometimes I've seen cases where people have tampered with the wells, which makes it a lot more difficult to deal with later on. So my advice is to seek expert advice that will let you know how to approach these. And main thing is, do it in a very safe manner. When you're looking for a well on the property, you may see some evidence such as pipes sticking out of the ground. You may notice some smells. You may notice some fluids flowing out. There may be some evidence of facilities such as tanks, pipelines that may have been associated with the oil and gas production previously. We have to remember that there's a long-term history, and sometimes we can use some metal detectors, gas detectors, but quite often I find that maps are really helpful. So in terms of where to start, a really good place to start is if you know your lot, your concession number, or your location, you can go to the OGSR library to find out if there are any records of wells either on your property or nearby your property. The website is here. I certainly encourage you that's a really good starting point. So when you look at the website, you can actually find out the information on the wells. This is very important because it could give you an idea of the depths, the type of construction. The records actually show the year it was drilled. It shows you whether it was plugged, whether it was abandoned, whether this was a part of a bigger network of wells. And that it also gives you a fairly good map location. So quite often, if there is something that is not on your property, you may be able to find out what was typically done in the area. My recommendation is when you come across a well, do not tamper with it. Mind your own safety and the safety of others. Visit the library, get the proper information. There may be some neighbors, there may be some other resources that are available. You can check with them. If you see any signs of any company that may have operated the well before, that would give you some information. You can actually contact some other agencies as well, essentially the MNRF or the MECP. We also have some resources available through some consultants that provide these kind of services, typically drillers, engineers, geologists that are involved in the oil and gas industry. In case of an emergency, of course, call the Spills Action Center, call the ministry. But we also have a technical resources team from the Ontario Petroleum Institute. We have contractors that are available to provide emergency response if required. This is a really interesting question. Who is responsible for unplugged wells or an oil and gas on your property? Is it the oil and gas company? Is it the landowner? Is it the ministry? Is it somebody else? The way that the legislation is written is we typically go back to the operator. And the operator is typically the company operating the well. If that doesn't exist, you can go back to the previous ones, or if nobody can be found as the operator, it actually goes back to the landowner. So this is a very, very, very difficult position for many of the landowners. They actually become the operator of the well by default. There is an abandoned works program. It's run by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. The problem is there's limited funds. Your wells had to get onto a list, and it may not get plugged in time. There's many variables, and I recommend that you follow up with the website that talks about abandoned works program. The thing to keep in mind is if it's on your property and it's your well, you're responsible for it. Now, mind you, some of these wells can be much more complex and much more difficult than others. The main thing is always keep in mind your own safety, safety of others, and also ensure that you're not causing bigger environmental hazards by your own actions. So I certainly recommend get the experts, get the knowledge, understand what it is that you're dealing with. One thing to keep in mind is what you see at the surface is a very small percentage of what actually exists in the well. These wells are open up to a number of deeper formations. They're open up to the freshwater aquifer. They're quite often open to some other porous zones, including the oil and gas zones. And they actually may have some waters that contain sulfurous compounds. So main thing is, when you look at the well, don't assume anything about what's underneath. Do the homework, find out what the well looks like, find out the well record, find out the well information, and certainly engage someone who's an expert that can tell you about the hazards and how to approach that well plugging in accordance with the regulatory requirements and also with what makes good engineering and technical sense to ensure that the well can be isolated and plugged properly. So when you're designing new wells, you put in a lot of safeguards now that perhaps didn't exist a long time ago. You will put in some conductor casings, surface casings, intermediate casings. All these casings are designed to help you isolate the fluids from migrating so we can contain the fluids where they belong. And we want to make sure that the fluids that we're trying to get inside the wellbore remain inside the wellbore. So that's a fancy way of saying we want to make sure that we contain the fluids where they need to be. We also need to understand the geology. It changes from different regions, different areas, and sometimes it even changes locally depending on what the circumstances are. There are technical resources available, books, geologists, library, that you can find out what the local geology is in your area. You also need to understand the geochemistry, and this can quite often get extremely complex. Some of the aquifers are local, some of them are regional, some of them contain fresh water, some of them may contain sulfurous waters, some of them may contain hydrocarbon fluids. So we really need to understand what it is that we're dealing with and where you may encounter these different formations that contain the fluids. This is kind of examples of some of the wells that we've seen, some of the information that you kind of need to know. Some of these wells get very, very sophisticated very fast. They can all be managed, but we need to make sure that the proper drilling and plugging techniques, the proper understanding in terms of the geology, the engineering is applied. And we want to make sure these wells are left in a safe condition for the future generations. So these are some of the wells that I've been involved with plugging. Certainly what you start off with, you do need to bring in a drilling rig. You need to go to the bottom of the well, make sure you isolate all the different zones as per the Oil, Gas, Salt Resources Act, the regulations, and the provincial standards. What this means is that you actually start isolating the well from the bottom, work your way up. Certainly, you do need to bring in the proper equipment. Quite often, you'll require some kind of logging equipment. This actually allows you to evaluate where the formations are, where you're likely to have some zones that may have some formation fluids that need to be isolated. It'll also give you an idea about what kind of cementing of the casings that was done previously. So logging trucks are quite often used to give you information and to ensure that you do the isolation and abandonment properly. This is a well that I was involved in where natural gas would come out from the ground and the local people would light fires there, kind of thing. Anyways, we found out that there was a well there. The well was subsequently plugged properly and is no longer a place for some mystery fires. Some of the wells that I've been involved in, quite often that we've had to get fairly exotic. And the fact is that I've been involved with ones that are probably more abnormal than the others. Each one, from my experience, has its own life, its own history, and its own challenges. But once you understand what the issues are, what the well is, what the construction is, you can quite often come up with an engineer or a revised engineering plan to deal with the problem wells. So in summary, my advice is don't tamper with the wells. There's many sources to get the information from the Oil, Gas, Salt Resources Library, from the regulatory agencies. You can check with the Abandoned Works Program. You can also check with the contractors, the drillers. But I want you always to keep in mind, it's always important to recognize the hazards and the safety associated with any well. There are a number of people that are available to assist you. One thing to keep in mind in Ontario is you have a well on your property, it needs to be licensed in order to work on it. And I'd certainly recommend that you use qualified people to properly plug the well. One thing you find is the longer you wait to plug the well, the more it's apt to get corroded, more it's apt to get some sloughing in the well. That means the well itself kind of caves in, makes it a bigger challenge. So I certainly recommend dealing it as soon as you can. And of course, let's do it right. Make sure it's properly designed, properly plugged, and we want to make it safe. We want to make sure that we leave a good legacy for the future generations. So again, just summarizing, I certainly recommend going to the Oil and Gas Salt Resources Library. There's information available about the geology. There's information available about the engineering. And I certainly recommend finding the original well records if possible in terms of where to go with that well from here. I think it's better when the wells are plugged right, and it certainly saves the environment.